She was gone before sunrise. No letter, no explanation. Just a for rent sign where everything he loved had been standing the day before. For 45 years, Tom believed she had simply chosen to leave. Chosen not to write, chosen to forget. Then a cardboard box in the back of a closet changed everything. 11 envelopes, his handwriting. Her name never opened. She had never known he wrote. He had never known she waited to fathers. One secret. And a love buried so carefully for so long that no one expected it to still be breathing. Until October changed everything. Tom Calloway stood at the kitchen window of the house he had lived in for 31 years. The same house where he had raised two children, buried a wife, and learned slowly, painfully, that silence could be both a comfort and a prison. Outside, the October sky over Greencastle hung low and gray. The kind of Indiana morning that smelled like wet leaves and something ending. The maple in the backyard had already shed half its leaves. A slow surrender he watched every year with the same quiet resignation. He was 63 years old, and most mornings felt like this, functional, unhurried, and just slightly hollow. The coffee mug read world's okayest dad. A gift from his daughter Claire 3 Christmases ago, back when she still thought jokes like that were funny between them. He smiled at it anyway, because Claire had inherited her mother's sense of humor. And smiling at that mug was one of the small ways he kept Linda close. Linda Calloway had died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. The speed of it had been almost merciful, the doctors said. Tom had never found a way to agree with that. He poured the cold coffee down the sink, rinsed the mug, and placed it on the drying rack with the careful precision of a man who had learned to fill hours with small acts of order. Then he pulled on his denim jacket, the one with the frayed left cuff that Claire had been threatening to throw away for 2 years, and walked through the back door into the yard. Greencastle in October was a particular kind of beautiful. The town of 12,000 souls sat in the rolling farmland of Putnam County, close enough to Indianapolis to feel connected to the wider world, far enough away to still feel like itself. Tom had been born here, raised here, and except for 4 years at Indiana State in Terre Haute, had never left. Some people thought that made him small. Tom had decided long ago that it made him rooted, which was a different thing entirely. He walked to the far end of the yard where the old oak fence needed a new post. It had been leaning since the summer storms, and crouched down to examine the damage. Physical work had become his therapy after Linda died. His hands knew what to do even when his mind wandered, and they wandered less when they were busy. He was measuring the post hole when his phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. It was his old friend Dale Pritchard. "You sitting down?" Dale asked, skipping hello the way he always had, even at 63. "I'm crouching next to a fence post," Tom said. "Close enough, heard something at the hardware store this morning." Dale paused, and Tom recognized the pause. It was the one Dale used when he thought information might land hard. Ruth Harlan's house on Vine Street. Apparently it's sold. Or it's about to. Someone came to town to handle the estate. Tom stayed very still. He hadn't heard the name Harlan spoken aloud in years. Ruth Harlan had been Maggie's mother. Had been past tense, which meant Ruth was gone, which meant the last living connection to that of his life was gone too. Who came? His voice was steady. He was proud of that. Carol Simmons ran into her at the county clerk's office yesterday morning. Dale said carefully. Said it was Margaret. Said she looked. Another pause. Real good, Tom. Tom stood up slowly, his knees registering the cold the way they always did now. He looked at the fence post without seeing it. Margaret Harlan. He hadn't said her name out loud in a very long time, but it had never fully left him, not the way a name does when a person is simply forgotten. It had stayed the way certain songs stay, surfacing unexpectedly in quiet moments, carrying weight that made no logical sense given how many decades and how much living had happened since. They had been 17. He had been so certain, the way only 17-year-olds can be certain, that what they had was permanent. And then one August morning in 1978, her family had been gone, the house emptied. no goodbye, no letter. No explanation that made any sense to a boy standing on Vine Street at 7 in the morning, staring at a for rent sign that had not been there the day before. "Tom," Dale said, "you still there?" "Yeah," Tom said. "Yeah, I'm here." "You want to grab lunch at Cunningham's. Talk it over." "I don't need to talk it over," Tom said. And then, because Dale had been his friend since the 4th grade and deserved honesty, "Maybe give me a couple hours." He hung up and stood in the cold yard for a long time, the fence post forgotten, the October sky pressing down on the maple and the yard and the ordinary life he had built on top of an old and unfinished story. Inside, he made a fresh cup of coffee. This one he actually drank. Cunningham's restaurant on Indiana Street had been feeding Greencastle since 1974, and its interior had changed so little in that time that eating there felt faintly like time travel. Same wooden booths, same laminated menus with the hand-drawn chicken illustration, same smell of pie and coffee that had soaked into the walls over 5 decades. Tom had eaten here with his parents, then with Linda, then with his kids, and now, increasingly, with Dale, the way old friends circle back to familiar places when the world changes faster than they can track. Dale was already in their usual booth when Tom arrived, nursing a Coke and looking like a man prepared to be careful. "I wasn't going to bring it up first," Dale announced. "Smart," Tom said, sliding in across from him. "But since you sat down with that face—" "What face?" "The one you've had since 1978 every time someone mentions, 'Order your food.'" Dale, they ordered the open-faced turkey sandwich for Tom, the meatloaf for Dale, because they had been ordering the same things at Cunningham's for 30 years, and then sat with the comfortable silence of men who had run out of the need to fill every quiet moment. It was Dale who finally spoke plainly. "She's staying at the Carpenter Inn on Seminary Street. Carol said she's been at the house every day this week, sorting through Ruth's things. Ruth passed back in June, apparently, didn't want any fuss, so there wasn't much notice. She was always a private woman," Tom said, meaning Ruth, though the description fit the daughter too. Carol said Maggie looked tired but good. Said she seemed, Dale searched for the word, settled calm, like someone who'd been through things. Tom nodded slowly. Hadn't they all? He knew the broad outline of her life, the way you know things in a small town even when you're trying not to know them. Through relatives who mentioned relatives. Through Carol Simmons, who knew everything and told most of it. Maggie had married a man named Robert Holt in the mid-'80s, lived most of her adult life in Cincinnati, 2 children. Then, somewhere in the early 2000s, the marriage had ended. Tom didn't know the details and had told himself, firmly and repeatedly, that he didn't need them. What he knew of his own life was less comfortable to summarize. He had loved Linda genuinely and completely, had built something real with her, had grieved her with the full weight of genuine loss. None of that was complicated. What was complicated was the thing that had existed before Linda, the thing that had never quite closed. The way a door left slightly ajar lets in a draft you eventually stop noticing but never fully stops feeling. After lunch, walking back to his truck on Indiana Street, Tom made a decision he would later struggle to explain rationally. He drove to Vine Street. He didn't plan to stop. He told himself that. He drove slowly past the Harland House, a white craftsman bungalow with green shutters, set back from the street behind a row of overgrown juniper bush that Ruth had apparently stopped trimming at some point in the last decade. He was passing it. He was simply passing it. The woman on the front porch saw him before he could continue. She was carrying a cardboard box, moving from the front door toward a mid-sized rental SUV parked in the driveway, and she stopped when his truck slowed. Even at this distance, even after 45 years, something in the way she stood, the slight tilt of her head, the way her hand came up to shade her eyes, was so familiar it made his chest ache with a specificity that surprised him. He could have driven on. He had several more seconds of reasonable deniability. Instead, he pulled to the curb. Margaret Harland, she had gone back to her maiden name. Carol had mentioned, was 63 years old. And she looked at the way people look their age when they've lived honestly, with silver in her dark hair, with lines at the corners of her eyes, with a quality of presence that younger faces don't have. She was wearing jeans and a gray fleece, practical clothes for the work of clearing out a mother's house. And she held the cardboard box against her hip like a shield she hadn't decided yet whether to lower. Tom got out of the truck. His niece complained he ignored them. "Tom Calloway," she said, and her voice was the same, lower than most women's, with a slight warmth underneath that had always made everything she said sound considered, like she meant it. "Maggie." The name came out simply, without the weight he'd feared it might carry. She looked at him for a moment that stretched longer than a moment, her expression unreadable in the careful way of someone who has learned to read their own reactions before showing them. "I thought I might run into you," she finally said. "Small town, 12,000 people," he agreed. Impossible to avoid. Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but its precursor. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said. "I heard. A few years ago, I'm sorry I didn't." She stopped. "I wasn't sure what would have been appropriate." "I appreciate it now," he said honestly. An awkward silence opened between them, the kind that contains too much history to be filled with small talk. Tom noticed she was gripping the cardboard box a little tighter. He noticed she didn't look away. "I have about 40 more boxes in there," she said eventually, with a gesture toward the house. "My mother kept everything. I mean everything. I found her 1962 electric bill this morning. Ruth was thorough," Tom said. "Ruth was a hoarder with excellent organizational skills," Maggie said. And this time the smile actually arrived. Brief, real, slightly tired. I don't want to impose. "But if you ever had an hour sometime this week, I have an hour now," Tom said. She looked at him for another long moment, weighing something he couldn't see. "Okay," she said. "Come in." The house smelled of old wood and lavender and the particular dustiness of rooms that have been closed too long. Tom carried boxes. Maggie sorted and labeled and made decisions about what to keep, what to donate, what to let go of, the quiet, difficult work of dismantling a life. They didn't talk much for the first hour. The work itself was a kind of conversation, a way of being in the same space without demanding anything of each other. It was late afternoon when they sat on the porch steps with 2 cups of tea Maggie had made from a box she found in the back of a cabinet. And Greencastle's October dusk settled over Vine Street in shades of amber and gray. "How long are you staying?" Tom asked. "End of the week." Maggie said, "Maybe a few days into next week. The realtor wants to list it by the 15th. "Long way to come for a week," he said. She looked at the juniper bush her mother had planted 40 years ago. "She was my mother," Maggie said simply. "You come." Tom nodded. He understood that completely. They sat with their tea, and the street was quiet. And somewhere down the block a dog barked twice and then went silent. And Tom thought carefully, cautiously, that whatever this was, it was something he was glad had happened. By Thursday, helping at the Harland house had become a routine. Tom arrived each morning around 9. After feeding the dog, an old beagle named Cracker who had been Linda's and now was simply his, and making his cold-going coffee. He told himself each day that he was helping a neighbor in need, performing a simple act of community. He also knew himself well enough to know that wasn't all of it. They had found their rhythm. Tom handled the physical work, the heavy furniture, the boxers that needed muscle, the stuck windows that hadn't been opened since Clinton was president. Maggie handled the sorting, the paperwork, the emotional archaeology of her mother's belongings. They talked while they worked, at first carefully, then with increasing ease. The way people talk when their hands are busy and there's no pressure to perform conversation. He learned things. She had taught middle school English in Cincinnati for 22 years before moving to a smaller school district in Dayton after her divorce. Her son, Nathan, was 34 and lived in Seattle. Her daughter, Elena, was 31 and lived in Nashville. She had 2 grandchildren, both from Elena, both under 5. She showed him photos on her phone with the quiet pride of a grandmother who has learned not to lead with the photos because people are politely obligated to look. "They're beautiful," Tom said, meaning it. "They're chaos," Maggie said, also meaning it, with a smile that contained whole volumes of tender exhaustion. He told her about Claire, 31, who worked in healthcare administration in Indianapolis and came home for most Sundays. He told her about his son, Mark, 34, who had moved to Denver 8 years ago and called every week with the conscientious regularity of a good son who lived too far away. He told her about Linda, briefly, in the way you speak of someone whose absence is still a physical presence in every room of your life. Maggie listened the way she had always listened, which was completely. It had been one of the things that had undone him at 17, that quality of attention. Most people listen to respond. Maggie listened to understand, and the difference was enormous. On Thursday afternoon, they found the box. It was in the back of the hall closet, behind Ruth's winter coats and a set of luggage that dated from the early 80s. An ordinary shoebox, sealed with tape that had dried to brittleness. Labeled in Ruth Harlan's precise handwriting, Margaret, Miscellaneous, High School. Maggie pulled it out and set it on the hallway floor, and something in her expression changed, a wariness. A slight drawing inward, as if she knew or suspected something about its contents before the tape was broken. "Do you want me to give you some space?" Tom offered. "No," she said, surprising him slightly. "Stay." She opened the box carefully. Inside were the predictable artifacts of a teenage girlhood, a homecoming corsage dried to brown petals, a class photo from 1977, a friendship bracelet, a movie ticket stub, a folded program from a school play. And then, at the bottom, held together with a faded rubber band that snapped when Maggie touched it, a stack of envelopes. Tom watched her face as she looked at them. He watched the color change, not dramatically, not the theatrical pallor of movies, but a quiet draining. As if something had shifted in her blood. "Maggie," he said. She picked up the first envelope. It was addressed to her, in handwriting that was young and slightly unformed and absolutely familiar to him because it was his own from 45 years ago. The return address was the house he had grown up in on Jefferson Street. The envelope had never been opened. She picked up the second, same handwriting. Same return address, sealed 3rd, 4th, 5th. There were 11 of them. Tom felt a strange sensation move through him. Not quite dizziness, but its emotional equivalent. A vertiginous realization that the floor of a story he thought he knew was not where he had believed it to be. "I wrote to you," he said, hearing how obvious that sounded even as he said it after you left. "For months I wrote." You never, he had assumed she had chosen not to respond. Had assumed, in the way of wounded 17-year-olds, that silence was an answer. You never got them. Maggie was very still, holding the stack of unopened envelopes in both hands. And her expression was the most unguarded thing he had seen on her face since she'd watched him pull to the curb on Vine Street. "I thought you didn't write," she said. Her voice was even, but barely. "I waited. For weeks I waited, and I thought," she stopped. "I thought I hadn't meant as much to you as I believed I had." Tom sat down on the hallway floor, his back against the wall, because standing no longer seemed like the right position for what was happening. "Why did you leave?" He asked that August. "No warning. No, my father," she said, and the two words contained a weight that needed no elaboration but would require it anyway. She sat down across from him in the narrow hallway, the shoebox between them, the 11 unopened letters in her lap. "He moved us. He told me it was work. His company needed him in Columbus. I believed him. I was 17. She looked down at the envelopes. "He told me he had spoken to you. That you had said." She closed her eyes briefly. "He told me you had said you thought it was for the best. That you were ready for a fresh start." Tom said nothing for a long moment. "My father told me you chose to go," he said finally. "That your family had been planning to move for months. That you had known and hadn't wanted to tell me." They looked at each other across the shoebox and the letters and the 45 years and understood simultaneously. The shape of what had been done to them. Outside, the October wind moved through the junipers. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked. Between them lay 11 letters written by an 18-year-old boy who had believed in something completely and had been told, in the efficient language of parental authority, that the something had not been real. "He lied to both of us," Maggie said. "It was not a question." "Seems that way," Tom said. She set the letters down carefully, as if they might break, though they had survived 45 years in a shoebox perfectly intact. Then she looked at Tom with an expression he recognized, though he hadn't seen it in decades, that directness, that unwillingness to look away from a difficult thing. "I need some air," she said. "Yeah," he said, "me too." They went out to the porch and sat on the steps in the cold afternoon, not talking, watching the street. After a while, Maggie wrapped her arms around her knees the way she had as a girl. And Tom thought he had never seen anything as simultaneously heartbreaking and familiar as that gesture. He didn't reach for her hand. It wasn't the moment for it. But he thought about it. The next morning, Tom drove to the county nursing home on Bloomington Street. His father, Gerald Calloway, was 89 years old and lived in room 14 with a view of the parking lot. A collection of Louis L'Amour novels he could no longer read without a magnifying glass, and a mind that was sharper on some days than others. Today, when Tom walked in, Gerald was sitting in his armchair watching the morning news with the sound too loud the way he always watched it. And he looked at his son with the alert, assessing gaze of a man who has learned to read faces over 8 decades. "You've got something on your mind," Gerald said, by way of hello. Tom turned the desk chair around and sat. He had rehearsed this conversation in the truck on the way over, running through approaches, deciding on directness. He was 63 years old. He had no patience left for the long way around. "Ruth Harlan died in June," Tom said. "Maggie is in town to settle the estate." Gerald's expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something in it stilled, like water when the wind suddenly stops. "I know what you did," Tom said. "I know you told her we were ready for fresh starts. I know she told Maggie that I said the same." Gerald looked at his hands, which were folded in his lap, marked by age and a lifetime of farm work before he went into insurance. He was quiet for long enough that Tom began to wonder if today was one of the harder days, if the conversation would have to wait. Then Gerald said, quietly, "You were too young." "We were 17, Tom said. "That's young. It's not nothing." "I had two requirements for my son's life," Gerald said, in the careful tone of a man who has rehearsed his own justification for many years. "That he finish his education and that he make a life here. Margaret Harland was going to be a reason to make choices you weren't ready to make. Her father and I." Tom sat very still, her father. Gerald looked at him directly for the first time. "Frank Harland came to me in June of 1978. He and Ruth were planning to move to Columbus for his work. That part was true. But he was worried that Margaret would refuse to go, or that she'd go and come back, or that he stopped. We both worried our children would make permanent decisions based on something temporary. We thought we were protecting you." "By lying," Tom said. "By managing a situation," Gerald said, with the tone of a man who had told himself a particular story long enough to believe it, though something in his voice now suggested the belief had worn thin over the years. "You met Linda. You had a good life." "Tom, I know I had a good life," Tom said, and the force of his own evenness surprised him. "That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what you took from two people. The right to choose, the right to know." He leaned forward. "She waited for my letters. Dad, she thought I had moved on without a word. For 45 years she thought that." Gerald was quiet for a long time. Outside his window, a car pulled into the nursing home parking lot. A nurse rolled a medication cart past the open door. "I've thought about it," Gerald said finally. "Over the years, I've thought about it more than you know." He looked at his son with the tired honesty of a very old man who has run out of reasons to be anything but. "I was wrong. The way I did it was wrong. I told myself it wasn't for a long time, but I was wrong." Tom sat with that. It was not entirely satisfying. There was no version of an 89-year-old man's late confession that could fully close something that had been open for 45 years. But it was real. It was the truth. Finally named aloud in room 14 of the Putnam County Nursing Home on a Friday morning in October. He stayed another hour. They talked about other things. The fence post, Mark's latest call from Denver. Whether the Colts had any realistic shot this season. Before he left, Tom put his hand briefly on his father's shoulder, and Gerald nodded, and neither of them said the things that were too big for the room. That afternoon, Tom went back to Vine Street. Maggie was on the porch when he arrived, sitting with a cup of tea and a look on her face that suggested she had been doing her own version of this morning's work. She watched him park and come up the walk. "I went to see my father," Tom said, sitting beside her on the steps. She turned to look at him. He confirmed it. "He and Frank planned it together. They thought they were doing right by us." He paused. "He knows he was wrong." Maggie looked at the junipers for a long moment. Her expression moved through several things Tom couldn't fully name, settling finally on something that looked less like anger than like grief. The sadder, quieter cousin. "My father died in 2009, she said. "So that conversation isn't available to me." "I know," Tom said. "I'm sorry." "I'm not sure what I would have said to him anyway," she said. "I loved him. He was difficult and certain about things, and he loved me in the way of men who believe love means control. But he was my father." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "What I keep coming back to is not what he did. It's what I lost without knowing I was losing it." She turned to look at Tom directly. "I spent years thinking you hadn't cared enough to write. That what we had been smaller to you than it was to me." "It wasn't," Tom said. "I know that now," she said. They were quiet for a moment, and the October afternoon went its slow, amber way around them, and Greencastle was quiet in the way of small towns on Friday afternoons. "I want to read them." Maggie said the letters. "I want to read what you wrote," Tom nodded. "They're yours," he said. "They were always yours." She went inside and came back with a stack, the 11 envelopes still sealed, their edges yellowed and soft with age. She opened the first one carefully, unfolded the pages. 2 pages, written both sides. In the cramped penmanship of an 18-year-old who had a great deal to say and was still figuring out how to say it, Tom watched her read. He did not look over her shoulder. He looked at the street, at the junipers, at the maple tree at the edge of the yard that still held a few bright leaves at its crown. He listened to the quiet of her reading, and when she finished the first letter and moved to the second and then the third, he felt something very old and very patient begin, with great care, to loosen. It was not forgiveness, exactly. It was not yet anything he had a word for, but it was something. And after 45 years, something was not nothing. The house on Vine Street sold on a Wednesday. Maggie had stayed 11 days, for more than planned, which she mentioned twice and did not seem troubled by. Tom had helped her finish the clearing, had driven loads to the Goodwill on Jackson Street and to the county dump, had sat with her on the porch through the negotiations with the realtor and the conversations with her children, who called from Seattle and Nashville with questions and concern and the particular mixture of helpfulness and helplessness that adult children bring to the long-distance management of their parents' lives. He had met Claire for Sunday dinner at Cunningham's, the 3 of them in the usual booth, and had watched his daughter study Maggie with a careful, intelligent assessment of a woman who loves her father and is deciding what to make of something new. Claire had asked Maggie about teaching, about Cincinnati, about her grandchildren, the small questions that contain larger ones. Maggie had answered with a directness and warmth that Tom had been rediscovering all week. By the end of dinner, Claire had offered to help carry furniture, and Maggie had laughed a real laugh, the kind that changes a person's whole face, and said she would take her up on it. Driving home that night, Claire had said, in the straightforward way she had always addressed important things, "She's good, Dad, she's really good." Tom had said, "Yeah," and looked at the road, and tried not to read too much into the way his chest had felt when he said it. On the evening before she left, they walked. It was Tom's suggestion, because the house was empty now and sitting in it with nothing left to do had a finality to it he wasn't ready to offer her. They walked the way they had occasionally walked in high school, through the neighborhood streets in the direction of the DePauw University campus, past the old brick buildings and the great trees and the particular quiet of a college town on a fall evening when the students had gone inside for the night. They had talked about a great many things over the 11 days, not always directly, not always comfortably, but honestly, with the honesty of people who have gotten old enough to know that dishonesty is mostly just delayed pain. They had talked about the letters, which Maggie had read all of over the course of 2 evenings, sitting alone in the empty house. She had told him that reading them had felt like standing in 2 times simultaneously, grieving what they had been while also, somehow, being returned something she hadn't known was still missing. They had talked about their marriages. Tom spoke of Linda with love and loss and no apology. He had loved his wife genuinely, had been faithful, had been present, had grieved honestly. Maggie spoke of her marriage to Robert with the measured candor of a woman who has done the therapeutic work of understanding something clearly without having to reduce it to simple terms. It had not been a bad marriage, she said. It had been a marriage between 2 people who had grown into different shapes, who had tried 4 years to fit those shapes together and eventually arrived, with sadness and without real bitterness, at the acknowledgement that they could not. Do you regret it? Tim had asked the marriage. I have Nathan and Elena, she said. I can't regret anything that gave me them. Tom had understood that completely. What they had not done over 11 days was talk directly about the thing that sat between them, present and unaddressed, like a piece of furniture too important to move and too large to ignore. The old feeling, because that was what it was, old and new simultaneously. The same root but different branches had been present in every conversation, in the ease that had returned between them, in the way the hours passed without weight, in the moments when one of them said something that made the other laugh and the laugh lasted half a second longer than laughter usually does. Tom was aware that he was 63 years old, that the last time this feeling had been available to him he had been 17, that whatever this was, it could not be what it had been then. It would have to be something new, built by people who had become, through decades of living, fundamentally different from the teenagers they had been on this same street in this same town. He was also aware that he was 63 years old and had learned, with some difficulty, that caution taken too far becomes its own kind of loss. They stopped at the corner of Indiana Street and Hannah, where they had once, in the autumn of 1977. He was almost certain, stood under a streetlight and talked for an hour about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. The streetlight was different now, LED instead of orange sodium vapor, but the corner was the same. I've been thinking, Maggie said, stopping and turning to face him. She had her hands in the pockets of her jacket and her expression was the careful, present one he had been watching since she arrived, the one that meant she was about to say something she had decided to say. Me too, Tom said. I live in Dayton, she said. I know, you live here. Have for 60 years, more or less. That's a logistical reality, she said. Yes, he agreed. She looked at him steadily. I'm not 17 anymore. I don't have the certainty I had at 17 about things working out simply because they feel right. Neither do I, Tom said. But I also know something I didn't know at 17, which is what it costs to not do the thing you're afraid of. Maggie considered that. Dayton is 2 hours, she said. 2 hours is nothing, Tom said. I drove to Terre Haute for 4 years. The corner of her mouth moved. That's not a direct comparison. No, he agreed. It's better. She looked at him for a long moment, the full, considering look, the one that meant she was deciding. And then she did something that he would think about for a long time afterward. In the way of moments that arrange themselves into landmarks, she reached out and put her hand against his arm. Briefly, with a directness that was neither dramatic nor tentative, but simply real. 2 hours, she said again, as if confirming something to herself. And a phone, Tom said. And email. And God help us both, whatever else people our age are supposed to use. She laughed. And the laugh was the same one he had known at 17 and also entirely new, full of everything between then and now. They walked back to Vine Street in the dark, the last October leaves coming down around them in the lamplight. Talking about small things, Claire's thoughts on the Colts, Nathan's job in Seattle, whether Cunningham's had always had that coconut cream pie or if it was recent. The conversation of people who are practicing the ordinary texture of each other's company, who are learning carefully that ordinary texture is where the real things live. At the house, now empty of everything except a few cleaning supplies and the for sale sign, they stood at the end of the front walk. "I'll drive you to the hotel," Tom said. "It's 3 blocks, Maggie said. "I know," he said. She smiled, and there was in the smile something unguarded and tired and glad that he had not expected, and that landed in him with the quiet force of something true. They drove the 3 blocks. He walked her to the door of the Carpenter Inn. They stood on the sidewalk in the October night, and the stars over Greencastle were very bright and very old. And Tom thought about 17 and 63 and everything in between. The years that had been full and the years that had been empty and the long. Strange mercy of arriving at 6 to 3 with enough life still ahead to make use of something you had thought was gone. "I'll call you," Maggie said. "I'll answer," Tom said. She went inside. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, in the cold and the starlight, and then walked back to his truck with the particular lightness of a man who has remembered something he didn't know he'd forgotten. 3 weeks later, he drove to Dayton on a Saturday morning. The drive took exactly 1 hour and 57 minutes, which he would mention to her as evidence, and she would tell him he had driven too fast. And he would say that was a matter of perspective. And she would shake her head and smile in the way that was new and also 45 years old. And they would sit in her kitchen with coffee that neither of them let go cold and begin. Some things take a long time to arrive. That doesn't make them less real. Sometimes it makes them more. The maple in Tom's backyard lost its last leaves that November. He raked them on a Sunday afternoon, crackers circling his ankles with senior beagle persistence. The sky the pale blue of Indiana autumn at its most honest. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Maggie. A photo of a coffee mug she'd found at a shop in Dayton. It read "World's okayest grandma." He laughed alone in his yard, in the cold and the quiet. The laugh of a man who has been returned something he had given up expecting. And the sound of it rose and hung in the November air and was, in its way, complete.